Okay, I think we're going to start. First of all, welcome to everybody. I see a lot of new faces here. Maybe that's because of our speaker. So my name, I'll say a few more words of introduction of both myself, in addition to the speakers, since there's so many new people here. I'm Steve Goodman. I'm one of the co-directors of Metrics. For those of you who don't know what Metrics is, we're a center that's been around Stanford for 3 years. That's transdisciplinary. We go from law school to medical school to the School of Humanities and Sciences, and we're devoted to the general cause of trying to increase the validity of scientific research. Our main focus is biomedical, but we like to say we're biomedical and beyond. And one of the many things we're trying to do is help establish this as a field by making people aware all over the world and certainly all over campus of how their work in whatever it is, methods, transparency, inference, law is all part of different sides of the same beast. In the past, we found that people sort of work in their own niches, in their own fields, and where the balkanization definitely has occurred is across different disciplines. So people are working in economics and physics and in social science and law all over the world in all domains of academia on these issues, but a lot of them don't talk to each other, and we have a lot to learn from each other, and we certainly learn that here. So among other things, we have postdocs who are in the room, and graduate students and staff, and any of you who are faculty who are interested in working with us, we want to know about you. We have about 15 faculty affiliates here at Stanford, and anybody who's a student who is interested in this, we want to know about too. So now, Ed Miguel is an economist at Berkeley, and he is co-founder and co-director of a very similar enterprise in the social sciences, and very, very ambitious and very active, called BITS, Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in Social Sciences. And they've been very active in this area. It's very exciting to explore the commonalities of the two groups. Ed is a development economist. He's worked a lot in Africa at the intersection of poverty, social structures, violence, and he can do a better job describing all that. We know he's important because he won the Ken Arrow Prize for Best Paper in his area in 2005. We know that's important because Ken Arrow is at Stanford, so anyway, so one of Ed's many, many activities, and he runs another group on CAGE, CEGA, Center for Effective Global Action. He's been making things move in a lot of areas for a long time, and today he's going to talk to us about transparency. Well, here it is. Transparency in economics, prospects for pre-specifying research hypothesis. Thanks for coming today.
Great, thanks a lot. It's great to be here. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces. I have a couple goals today. I want to give you guys a little bit of the lay of the land in what we're doing with BITS, which Steve just mentioned, and give you a sense of points of contact between what we're doing and what's going on here, and also survey some of the developments in economics in this area. And I'm going to sort of get into probably in greatest depth an almost 20-year-old case that's really way ahead of its time, a paper that used pre-specification that was effectively a registered report, which I'll talk about soon, almost 20 years ago. So there's a couple different goals for the talk, but I think they're held together by some of the common interests that we share here. So just to start off, I wanted to again just highlight what Steve said. I'm one of the founders of the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, and sort of along the way I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're up to. But we're also an interdisciplinary center that aims to advance an agenda of transparency, reproducibility, and really scientific validity in the social sciences. And we aim to bring people together. And that's part of why I'm so excited about this talk, is we found through BITS, and I'm sure you found the same thing with Metrics, that when you get people in the room across disciplines, it turns out we face a lot of the same challenges. We're thinking about the same issues. And by communicating across some of our usual disciplinary borders and boundaries, we can make a lot of progress. So that is one of the goals of this talk. today, and I'll tell you a little more about bits later on. So again, I know it's a mixed audience. Probably a lot of you who work with metrics. For you guys, the first 5 minutes of my talk or so are going to be super boring. Oh my gosh, there's all these problems with scientific validity. Let me go through them quickly, but don't hesitate to stop me. Again, I know there are disciplinary differences here, but it would be rude of you among economists not to interrupt me all the time. So just jump in there and tell me how I'm getting it right or wrong. The starting point for us is there's a growing awareness of the limitations of our empirical research. There's a concern, there's a lot of false positives out in the world, and of course Johnny Amides here has the seminal paper on that. There's a great paper. This is another paper that has a Stanford connection, the Franco et al. Paper, which documented just how many null results disappear. So for folks who aren't familiar with that paper, which came out in Science a year and a half ago, this was a case where to get access to a database of social science data, researchers had to put in a very detailed research plan. And so these scholars were able to track how many results came out of all these plans, and they followed up with the original authors to find out what the findings were. And it turns out, if you had statistically significant results, the vast majority of those studies had been published a few years later, whereas the vast majority of papers with null results remained unwritten. So it was just a very clear quantitative illustration of this issue of the result driving what gets seen by the scientific community. Huge problem. It's a huge problem. There's been a lot of progress in diagnosing these problems. What I want to talk about today is a solution, a potential solution, one which has been around a lot longer on the medical research side than on the social science research side, which is study registries, pre-specifying research hypotheses, hypothesis documents, but one that's actually growing in economics and the social sciences. So I want to talk about the progress we've made, but also sort of how limited that progress is. So again, looking forward to an agenda. With co-authors, including a bunch of people here at Stanford, David Layton, also Brian Nosek, for people who know him from the Center for Open Science, et cetera. Kate Casey, who's here at Stanford. We published a paper in Science 2 years ago that lay out kind of broad classes of potential solutions to these issues of sort of non-random reporting results. One of them is disclosure. This is one that psychologists have taken the lead on. It's also an important issue in medical research. Another is the importance of open data and materials to allow for replication. Again, a central part of transparency is just sort of seeing what was done. And then the third set of solutions are, broadly speaking, pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, et cetera. And the goal of pre-registration is to really set in stone what your plans are before you've seen the data, before the data mining and phishing process starts, or the p-hacking process. There's so many different words for this sort of phenomenon. The reason why pre-specification matters is replication may not be enough. It may be the case that actually if I share my data with you, you can replicate what I did, the code works. But I may have run 50 analyses before I settled on the one that I'm sort of sharing with you to replicate. And in order to really draw conclusions about the results, I have to have a sense of what you ran. I have to have a sense of what the starting point was, just to get proper p-values, if nothing else. There are multiple testing corrections we could bring in if I actually knew what you did. Pre-specification, could be a very important part of the solution. So let me tell you where economics is on this, and of course, there's clinical trials. On the medical side, there's a bunch of different registries. All of this is a lot newer in the social sciences, and in many ways was inspired by what's gone on in medicine, but we've taken a little bit of a different direction, and let me tell you where things are at, and then I'll get to this case that I want to emphasize in my talk. Pre-specification means we're going to write down our research hypotheses before we touch the data. There is a question, and this is a big open question in economics right now, about how detailed these analysis plans should be, pre-analysis plans. The tradition in medicine is I think there is a range of detail in pre-analysis plans. Some hypothesis documents are pretty sparse. Some may be more detailed. In economics as well, it's a bit of an open question. Some folks have been arguing for pretty slimmed down sparse plans. Others, including myself, looking at Marshall here, like in some of the stuff we've done together, that Marshall's done or I've done, we've had pretty detailed analysis plans down to sort of specification by specification, outcome by outcome, robustness check by robustness check. And the advantage of pinning things down is maybe it leaves less scope for data mining. At the same time, you may be concerned that there are aspects of the data or characteristics of the data that make it hard to pre-specify too much. So what does the economics registry allow for? Starting in 2013, there's a formal American Economic Association registry. So this was a big deal, building on clinicaltrials.gov. It's only been around for a few years. It was controversial when it was launched. A lot of senior figures in the field were very skeptical about the registry. But I'm going to make the case that it's actually been quite successful. So to start with, you can see they were very ambitious in naming the registry. It wasn't just the economics registry. It was the social science registry. So a little bit of economics imperialism as usual in the social sciences. It's a very user-friendly registry for those who have checked it out. You click on register trial, and it walks through a pretty easy set of user interfaces, which I'll talk about. The first thing to know about the registry is in the last few years, there have been lots of studies registered. Over 660 studies as of, I think, a few weeks ago when I looked at it. And I will say that in my own field of development economics today, for new studies, especially by younger scholars, the norm is to register a pre-analysis plan if you're doing an experiment. Development economics has been in the lead in economic subfields in embracing experimental methodologies. A lot of, there were also early experiments in some other fields, but development economics, I think it's fair to say, was the first subfield where it became completely normal to run field experiments. So maybe it makes sense that we'd also be the first to embrace these new methods. But it is the norm now to write a pre-analysis plan for new studies. That is a big cultural change. This is something that until a few years ago was unknown. I'll talk about this study from the 1990s, which we had sort of forgotten about until recently, but the latest wave and the first sort of real wave of pre-analysis plans and pre-registration in economics really only started in 2009, 2010. So very, very new stuff. Lots of studies. Some of these 660 are older studies, completed studies that folks are putting on the registry for completeness. One of the nice things about a registry is then you can get the lay of the land of a whole literature, and so people are being encouraged. I'm encouraging my students. I'm doing it myself. We're registering our older studies, but most of these seem to be new studies. So this is the trajectory. Nice upward sloping. Lots of studies registered every month. Actually, the number of new studies registered every month has been rising and has continued rising. So, registration isn't something that just sort of happened for a few months and everybody forgot about it. This is becoming the norm in a bunch of different fields. In economics, where now you have 30 or 40 studies being registered a month.
Do you have any sense of what percentage that is of the plausible total?
We don't yet. We've been trying to think of how we can define what that is. There's so many studies that are in early stages. There's so many different funders that it's hard to say. I think one of the things we're hoping to do with BITS in the next year or so is start doing more systematic surveying of practices in the social sciences, and that'll help us answer this question. If we can get a decently representative sample, we can answer, but we don't know yet.
And do you have the help, like we do in medicine, of the journals and any other enforcement or encouragement structures?
Yeah, so what's interesting about this is really a case of decentralized norm changing. Economics journals have been very slow to embrace new transparency and reproducibility practices. About a year and a half ago, and I don't know if any folks in the room were involved in some of this, Brian Nosek he organized a conference a year and a half ago at UVA, which turned into a science piece that came out last spring on new journal practices, the so-called TOP guidelines. So I think some of you may be familiar with them. And the goal was to come together around a set of principles and to try to get journal editors to sign up to principles. Like, we want to encourage replication. We want to encourage sharing data. We want to encourage pre-registration. These kinds of things. And myself and a bunch of other economists who were involved in this really struck out in terms of getting leading economics journal editors to take part. But there were leading psychology journal editors, political science, cognitive science, some medical journals, et cetera. So, scores and scores of journal editors signed on to these guidelines, and we really couldn't get economists interested. So this is a case where the researchers themselves, at least in development economics, we've just reshaped norms in our field, and hopefully the journals will help with enforcement. But this is going on without enforcement. If there were enforcement, I think it might be even higher. Any other questions while I'm at this point in sort of describing the lay of the land? Okay, please feel free to jump in at any point. Okay, so what's required on the AAA site if you do want to register a study? The AAA site is sparse. You can actually register a study without a tremendous amount of detail. You do need to list, a broad description of the study. You do need to list broadly what the experimental design is going to look like, how many, is it clustered, what the main outcomes are. So those are important in their own right, and just having a broad sense of what the research design is, the main outcomes are, et cetera, is going to constrain data analysis to some extent. So this is very valuable, but it's still pretty sparse. And a lot of the pre-analysis plans that have been registered have a lot more detail than this in economics. So, but again, there's still a bit of an open question of how detailed it should be.
How much in economics is there concern about having people steal ideas with too much specification?
Yeah, so on the AAA registry, you can register and timestamp things without it being fully public. So you can wait, and I forget exactly how many years. There is some limit of how long it can remain. It might be 3 years. I think there's a pretty lengthy window, and I think that was part of the initial compromise over the study. The issue of scooping is actually a huge concern for scholars. And I think there's fear that if you don't allow for some window of privacy, folks just won't register. So there is an allowance for that here. Okay, so again, very user-friendly for folks doing experiments in economics or other social sciences. Play around with it, and you'll see you can register a study in an hour or something like that.
Is there a requirement to update and report when the trial is finished, or is it open-ended?
It's open. There's no enforcement. It's all at this point, decentralized. The journals aren't enforcing it. What's going on, it's pretty interesting. A number of centers, like my center, Steve mentioned the center that I direct at Berkeley, the Center for Effective Global Action, which is a development economics center. The Jameel Poverty Action Lab, based at MIT, et cetera. A couple of leading research centers in development economics are strongly encouraging all of our affiliates to use the registry, to update it. The Poverty Action Lab is actually putting some staff time into helping folks get their older studies posted, their backlog of studies, to make sure the registry is fairly complete. So again, a bunch of institutions are weighing in and getting a lot of registration, but doing it in a way absent some sort of enforcement. That's where we're at right now. So in some ways, we're in an early stage.
What has been the perspective of NSF economics section? I mean, where are they at on this?
They've attended several BITS meetings, NSF staff. They're interested. There are actual data sharing, formal data sharing requirements for NSF-funded studies, et cetera. They're just not, my understanding is they're not really enforced. So there are standards for data sharing and standards for efforts to promote replication, but no one's really enforcing them. So again, I think we're in a world of voluntary action, but the rules on the books seem quite progressive. And in many ways, the AEA has, it's interesting, you might imagine the association would be more conservative than the profession, but actually the AEA has been ahead of the curve. The AER was the first journal to mandate replication data sets be posted back in 2005 or 2004 when Ben Bernanke was one of the editors. They put the registry together even though there was a lot of opposition from some empirical scholars. So the AEA has actually been pretty progressive on it, but there's no enforcement. We're in a place where you can now register, you're encouraged to share data, but unlike in medicine where there were editor statements around, I guess around 2000 was around the time when some of the, or maybe a little bit after 2000 when some of the leading health journals came together and said, you will no longer publish an RCT unless it was registered.
Yeah, that was around 2006.
Or 2006, okay, so even more recent. There's been no such move in economics yet. I've had conversations with a lot of different editors, and their feeling is the profession isn't there yet. Our view at BITS is, and I'll tell you what we're doing in terms of training and dissemination of ideas like this, is over time the profession norms will shift in the profession, and it'll almost be a formality when these things are made rules. Yeah.
What proportion of the registrations are ones that are kind of backdated? And is there a way maybe to compare those to see how much people might actually be ex post changing the way they quote unquote pre-register?
We could do that. We've scraped this data and we just haven't looked at that. That's something we easily could do because we have completion dates. So that unlike, I don't have the denominator for Steve's question, but there we could do it and tell you exactly what proportion are new or complete. I just don't have it on me. My sense in the early days, when this thing was starting, we were all kind of looking at what was being registered. I think in the early months, a lot of these were new studies. And recently, there's been more of the backlog getting into the registry as SIGA and the Poverty Action Lab and others have been trying to push our affiliates to get their old studies on the books. But it's a combination.
Are you trying to get together all the funders? Because if the funders made this a requirement, then it would get done.
Yes, we haven't yet done that. Some funders were at the meeting Brian Nosek organized a year and a half ago. Some funders in the development economics space have taken the lead in promoting these practices, but we're still at an early stage. Again, the norms are changing faster than the rules. Marshall?
Maybe this is where you're going, in which case, fine. But given the large amount of sort of non-RCT research in this field, how do you, will there soon be a secondary data registry for?
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going, and I'm going to get to that in 5 minutes. So thank you for teeing it up. What I'm going to, the point of this, the first 10 or 15 slides was to say, hey, we're actually making progress on experiments, but the latest estimates, when you look at the top 5, top 10 economics journals, is something like 85% of empirical studies are still non-experimental studies. What can we do there? How can we make progress there? This is another area where medical researchers, epidemiologists, et cetera, have had a debate over the last few years. And I'll tell you the state of the debate in economics, which is like, again, given the resistance to formalizing things, even for prospective experiments where it's really straightforward to do this stuff, you can imagine the state of affairs for non-experimental stuff. The point of this talk is to say, hey, there's 3 or 4 things we could do now that would move us forward in a sort of meaningful way. So that's going to be the back end of the talk. So thanks for teeing me up, as we talked about before. Thanks, man. Great. I'm going to very quickly go through the benefits of pre-registration. This is a savvy audience. I just want to list through the benefits, and then we're going to get to non-experimental work. What are the benefits of having a registry? There's a paper trail. You can see what people plan to do. You get a sense of missing studies. It's going to be useful for meta-analyses. It can be useful for a lot of things. So that's an obvious benefit. It's going to limit data mining. People are going to call on you. There's some accountability. Hey, you said you were going to regress mortality on your treatment. I want to see that specification. So it limits the amount of cherry picking. I have a much better sense of what your p-values are when I know how many tests you ran than when I have no idea how many tests you ran. So again, sort of size of statistical tests, much more meaningful when I have a sense of what you've done. Open data and disclosure are more effective when you can cross-check it with what people said they were going to do, or else I'm replicating your study, and that's the 100th thing you tried. Another side benefit, and this is one that I think is sort of underappreciated, is having to pre-register and write a pre-analysis plan actually makes you think through what you're doing before you do it. So sometimes folks launch studies and experiments, and of course they've thought it through, and they're putting time and resources into it, but like having to put it down on paper, write it down, think about it, can help you find mistakes, find errors, improve what you're doing. It gives you a document that's easily shareable with other scholars so they can give you feedback. So this is another benefit of pre-registration, I think. Okay, and then maybe there's others. I'm going to kind of skip forward. Of course, the concern that's come out in our discussion, oh yeah?
So why would this be more demanding than the specification you give to, let's say, just get the funding in the first place or get the approval from IRB or any of these places?
I think that's one of the arguments that's often been made by John Ioannidis here and others in articles. Hey, we're already kind of doing this, maybe not exactly in the form of a pre-analysis plan, but something similar. And so how much of a burden is this really? We have to put it in IRB. I've got to go to apply at NSF to get funding. If only we had the universe of all those funding proposals, we effectively have pre-analysis plans. So again, maybe we're overstating the cost. I will say that we all put a lot of time into our funding proposals. When you are going to go on the record with a pre-analysis plan and you're just about to post it right when data collection is starting, a lot of work goes into it, a lot of thought. So I think there is yet more work that's done when you know you're going to be on the record for running those specifications, but you have a starting point, which is the proposal. So it's a good point. There's a concern that pre-registration will stifle creativity, and people always point to all the great scientific discoveries that happen without pre-analysis plans, rightfully so. A lot of stuff is accidental. We really often don't know what we're doing, and stuff kind of hits us in the face. That's what happens. Don't tell Congress. But the goal of pre-specification isn't to say you shouldn't be doing this kind of exploratory work. It's just to make clear what is exploratory and what isn't. And again, just for understanding statistical significance levels, this is pretty important. Right now, people run lots of analyses and then they often write papers pretending as if this is the hypothesis they had all along. And that's not really how the scientific process went. Okay, so I think this is review for everybody. So let me get to some of the new stuff. The open question, focus today for the next 15 or 20 minutes, is how widely can we apply these tools? For experiments, we're making progress in economics. Actually, political science has a registry, the EGAP registry. There's hundreds of studies registered in EGAP. So in economics and political science, this is starting to take off. It's not there yet, but things are moving in the right direction. What about this 85% of empirical work that's non-experimental? How are we going to bring these tools in there? Let me talk about a few applications, and then I'll talk about the Newmark study from the late 90s. Right now, the community within economics that's really dived in and accepted pre-analysis plans most is development economics. But folks who do lab experiments in economics could just as well register the research hypotheses. It's prospective, straightforward to do. They're also writing funding proposals. Presumably they have some idea of the test they want to run. It seems like low-hanging fruit. There's been some resistance, though, among leading experimental economists to this. There's an active debate. A lot less experimental economics is being registered right now. Muriel Niederle, prominent experimental economist here at Stanford, has written recently saying, you know what? For lab experiments, this stuff is superfluous because you can replicate lab experiments. So they acknowledge, she and co-authors acknowledge, she has some work also with Lucas Kaufman. Yeah, if you're doing the big field experiment in Sierra Leone, like some of the work I've done, multi-million-dollar experiment, years in the making, I've got one shot at that experiment. I can't replicate that experiment. You really should pre-register that. But if I can just sort of like next week get another 200 subjects in the lab, just prove validity, scientific validity through replication. That's been one of her arguments. Now, the flip side to that is these days, lab experiments are often context specific for people sort of in the loop on recent experimental economics literature. They're very often linked to field experiments. Lab experiments are being run during elections. They're being done during with very specific contextual factors that matter. In that case, for instance, we did some experiments a couple of years ago during the last Kenyan election. We ran a series of lab experiments with timing around the Kenyan election to see how behaviors changed in the context of an election. I can't replicate that. I can't go back in time. I can't do it. So maybe she's right for relatively context-free experiments, that replication is a better approach or an alternative approach. But there's going to be a lot of contexts where you really do need some pre-specification. So that's one. What I want to talk about today is prospective non-experimental studies. There's a ton of prospective non-experimental work in economics. A huge chunk of empirical work fits in this category. And for the same reasons that we can pre-register prospective experimental work, we can often register prospective non-experimental work, but basically no one is doing it. So this to me is an area ripe for pre-analysis plans and an embrace of this agenda. And I'll talk about the Newmark study in a second here. Okay, what are some other, how could this be applied to prospective non-experimental work? Very often, researchers are waiting for a new wave of a survey to come out. As anybody knows in empirical work, gosh, the next wave of the census is coming out. The next wave of the PSID, the NLSY. This new wave is coming out. Oh, there's all this stuff I want to study with this new data that's coming out. If it hasn't been released yet, you couldn't have mined it yet. So this is an area where if you have well-articulated research hypotheses, you could register your plan before you've credibly had access to the data. No one may have access to the data at this point, and get on the record with your hypotheses before it's released. So this seems like an approach. Now, the AA registry is meant to be an RCT registry, but there's a lot of other mechanisms you could use to formally register your hypotheses. For instance, the Open Science Framework, based at COS, Center for Open Science, has a mechanism where you can publicly timestamp any sort of document you want and sort of publish it, so you can credibly pre-register research hypotheses. This could be done clearly for the kinds of applied micro, labor economics, public finance work that where economists are used to getting new data. But the basic approach could actually be used in other fields of economics. So this is a little bit more inside baseball for the 5 or 6 of you who are economists, but here are some other applications. Before there's a release of data, macroeconomists who want to do calibrations can get on the record and register the parameters they're going to use in their calibration. So for non-economists, macroeconomists do what they call quantitative exercises, which are really model calibrations. They're going to pin down the economic model they're going to use, what interest rate they're going to assume, various other parameters they're going to assume. And a critique that those of us outside of macro often have is to say, well, you know, how much did you guys fiddle around with all those parameters to get a result that looks sensible? It'd be really nice for these guys to get on the record with those parameters before they've seen the data. That's one application. For any sort of structural estimation, again, where there's a very large number of parameters and a lot of assumptions that go into the empirical work, it'd be nice to get on the record on all of those before you've seen the data. So that's another application. Same thing for sort of specifying priors for Bayesian statistics. So I think there really are actually a lot of applications, and we haven't even scratched the surface in economics with all these applications. Again, Steve asked this very good question about scooping. And again, both the AEA registry and Open Science Framework have windows where you can keep something private. You can timestamp it, but not make it public right away, so you can, you're not going to be afraid of some sort of theft of intellectual property here, if you have a new idea. Okay. Great. I think I have like 10 minutes. Let me quickly go through the Newmark and then open it up for broader questions. I want to mention this David Newmark study because as we started pre-registering and writing pre-analysis plans and publishing some of these early pre-analysis plan-driven papers in economics, we were informed by labor economics colleagues that, there was this one thing that happened in the late 90s that sounds an awful lot like this. And in my own view, this is a milestone in research that was almost forgotten until recently. And so to my knowledge, this was the first pre-analysis plan in economics. In the 1990s, as today, the issue of what the labor market consequences of raising the minimum wage was a really big deal. David Card, my colleague at Berkeley, Alan Kruger at Princeton, published famous work using quasi-experimental design showing that, hey, moderate minimum wage increases did not lead to more unemployment. That's the economics hypothesis, right? As you guys know from reading the news or from your economics courses, if you increase the wage, you'd think there'd be less hiring. But how large that effect is an open question. It's an empirical question. Card and Kruger showed minimal effects. Other scholars showed large effects using different data. So there was this contentious debate that was going on. And one of the scholars who was in his work showing large effects was David Newmark. But what Card and Kruger did is they put together a bunch of the estimates that were out there in the early to mid-90s and said, wow, estimates are just all over the place. Some people find these really big negative effects. Employment's going to fall a lot with the minimum wage. Other people found zeros. And there was a concern that data mining had a hand in this, that there were what was being called in the literature at the time author effects, meaning authors had an agenda, and they were sort of pushing their agenda with the work. And again, these are typically non-experimental studies. There's a lot of plausible statistical approaches you could use with the data. How much of the difference in findings was being driven by these author effects? And this is when an editor at the journal Industrial Relations, a labor economics journal, had an idea. The editor at the time was David Levine, my colleague at Berkeley, at the business school in Berkeley. He was working in this literature too, and he wanted to bring the two sides together and try to reach scientific consensus. And he proposed the following thing. He said, there have been some minimum wage increases. There's going to be a release of data, U.S. government data soon that allow you to study employment effects. Every few months there's CPS released, there's other data released. He said, I want you guys to write down your analysis plan before the data comes out. He basically was asking them to pre-specify their approach. He approached Alan Kruger, he approached David Newmark, they started talking about it, and said, okay, let's try this thing out. Let's pre-specify, no data mining. Let's try to get on the same page. And again, the goal here was to have estimates free of author effects, so free of any kind of manipulation. I mean, they were totally blunt, and in some ways, the kind of rivalry between these groups of authors hasn't ended. I mean, they're still kind of bickering at each other, and of course, California is going to raise the minimum wage a non-trivial amount in the next 5 years, so this will be a good pre-specify now, please, everybody. Don't wait until 2022, and then now's the time. So how did David Levine have this idea? Well, he was friends with Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's a psychology and economics scholar. And Danny, who's very conflict averse, throughout his career had reached out to folks with different views and tried to forge what he called adversarial collaboration. Like, okay, I got this in my experiment, you got that in your experiment. Let's run a lab together. And let's agree ex ante what the right test is and run the lab together. So he had done this, he had told David Levine about it. So actually David Levine's ideal was going to be for David Newmark and Alan Kruger to write the paper together. Let's agree these are the right specifications. At the last minute, Alan Kruger backed out and didn't want to participate. That's my understanding talking to David Levine. But David Newmark agreed to participate, and he did something very interesting. He said, I'm going to show a couple of different specifications, regression models, some that are like the ones I've been running in my papers, and some that are like the ones Card and Kruger have been running. So actually his pre-analysis plan showed a couple of different specifications, and he was trying to bridge the field a little bit. So it's a pretty interesting thing to read. You can find his paper ended up getting published a few years later, and there's a kind of editorial by David Levine explaining the process. It's neat intellectual history for people that want to kind of dive deep. This approach is actually very similar to what today is being called a registered report. So some of you may be familiar with this. A number of psychology journals, at least one political science journal, a bunch of cognitive science journals, just in the last few years have made this a new article type, where people submit their analysis plan in advance, get it refereed, and if it's considered an important question and good research design, etc., it gets what's called in-principle acceptance, which is kind of like an R&R, a revise and resubmit. Then they get the data in and write it up. But acceptance will not be determined by the results you get. So if you get a null result, you get a null result. But the question was judged sufficiently important scientifically, it should be published either way. So again, this is a couple decades or 15 or so years ahead of its time, just to kind of review what the standard publishing model is versus a registered report. The standard model is we think of an experiment, we get the data, we analyze it, we write it up, and then at that point, it goes through, it undergoes peer review, and it's published. Basically, what registered reports do is they push that peer review much earlier. I design it, you tell me whether it's a good project or not, I get feedback on it early on, I can kind of improve it, and then I go through the rest of the process and try to get it published. And as long as I wrote it up nicely and kind of presented the results in a sensible way, I'll get published. So this is the registered report approach. And this is sort of what the timeline looked like. For Newmark, there were these minimum wage increases signed into law, but the data wasn't going to be released till later. So before the data was released, Newmark submitted his analysis plan to David Levine, who had it, said, yes, I've gotten it, here it is, and tried to hold him to it. So when the data came in, David Newmark analyzed it, and the paper got published very much along the lines of the original specification. So it's basically a registered report that they were doing in the late 90s. Okay. So what happened, and sort of how do people view it? David Newmark's write-up is pretty interesting because he touches on some of the issues I've been talking about the benefits of pre-specification versus the loss of flexibility, if the sort of data turns out differently than you expect. His point is, in areas where we kind of know, we have a good conceptual framework, we have experience working with this type of standard government data, etc., there really aren't that many degrees of freedom. So let's just pin it down. We kind of know what we're supposed to do. There isn't going to be too much of a cost of writing down the model in advance. So I'm not going to show the quote, but basically saying in this case, we're not going to have much severe specification error when we kind of know what we're doing. So that was his point. Now, you could look at this the other way and say, gosh, in these areas we already know what we're going to do. Why the heck do we need a pre-analysis plan? Everybody kind of knows what the right regression model is. But there's less cost of doing it too. We have a good sense of what the range of different regression approaches are going to be. In a project of mine, we wrote a pre-analysis plan for this Casey et al. Paper. This is Kate Casey here in the business school, your guys' colleague here. Our paper came out a few years later. We worked in an area where there was a lot less agreement about the right regression approach. We were studying the impacts of what in development is called a community-driven development project, CDD, which is an attempt to democratize, make government more inclusive, et cetera, at the village level. We were interested in social capital outcomes. We were interested in voting outcomes. it was sort of a sprawling project, and we had literally had hundreds of different outcome measures in our survey, literally. So endpoints, I think, in medical research they'd be called. So you might say here, actually pre-specification is particularly important because like the scope for data mining with that many outcomes, where you could plausibly make the case for so many different approaches would be even greater. Anyway, pre-specification can be used in different cases. Let me wrap up and just tell you what happened. What did Newmark find? Newmark found something pretty interesting. Newmark found estimates sort of in the middle of the range of previous estimates. They weren't statistically significant, but they were a little more negative than Card and Kruger found. It turned out his research design was underpowered. So it wasn't going to be the definitive word anyway. But it's interesting that his estimates were kind of in the middle and maybe says something about the literature. Of course, there was nothing to stop him, and he didn't do this, but there's nothing to stop him from saying, oh, look, I pre-specified this approach. Let me keep accumulating data over the next few years until I am sufficiently powered to study effects. But that isn't what happened. But in any case, he found something in the middle. He did present some non-pre-specified analysis, and he noted it in the text very clearly. So this is another thing that's become the norm in economics with pre-analysis plans. All of us who've been advocating for pre-analysis plans, of course, have said for transparency, you've got to make it really clear in your paper what was pre-specified and what wasn't, or else it defeats the point. So Newmark, again, was ahead of his time on this. Okay, so let me just kind of start wrapping up here and then just say a word or two about BITS and how it fits into all of this. Really, the point of today's talk was to get everybody on the same page about what economics is doing, what's going on in the social sciences, talk about progress and experiments, but really make the case at the end of the day. If you take one thing away from the talk, there are a lot of avenues for the application of pre-specification that we're not even beginning to explore in economics, especially in terms of prospective non-experimental studies. Whenever you don't have the data on hand yet, you could imagine pre-specifying outcomes. Now, I will say that a number of prominent medical researchers, including John Ioannidis and others, have been arguing for pre-specifying observational analyses even when the data is publicly available. Saying, again, you're writing an IRB, you're doing other things before you analyze the data. Why not register those as well? And they make some very good arguments for why you should register them. But for instance, in the Del Rey et al. Piece from a couple of years ago, that they write, they do acknowledge that in cases where data is already publicly available, it's going to be pretty hard to know what people really had access to before they registered their analysis plan. And that is, I think, a major stumbling block to the credibility of registration for observational studies when the data is already out there. It may still be worth doing, but it's going to be hard to verify what people did and didn't have access to, whereas with prospective studies, like the data doesn't exist yet. It's just a lot easier for that to be credible. So I think that's another major area of discussion in the transparency movement right now. Let me take 2 minutes and tell you what BITS is doing. I'd love to hear if people are interested in getting involved, or if you see points of contact between what Metrics is doing. BITS has a number of different activities, and they sort of expanded over time. We started with training courses. We've had a few summer institutes at this point. In Berkeley, we have another one coming up in June for advanced PhD students and postdocs interested in these topics, interested in operationalizing pre-analysis plans and disclosure statements and data sharing and those kinds of issues. So that's coming up in June. And we're beginning to organize workshops elsewhere. We've had a couple of workshops in East Africa in the last year to try to spread these ideas to other research communities internationally. Together with those training courses, we've posted a pretty extensive set of teaching materials. So if you're interested in one of your classes and having a lecture or part of a lecture on one of these topics, check out the website, go to the teaching materials. We have multiple different versions of slide decks that I've taught. I taught a grad class on these topics last year at Berkeley that have been taught in the Summer Institute, and we've organized them and they're searchable. So go in and grab a lecture on pre-analysis plans or data sharing or disclosure or differential privacy or a lot of the other issues that come into play here. More recently, we've started a few new efforts. With funding from BITS and Metrics Common Donor, we've actually had a few rounds of grant competitions for meta-research, replication, and transparency-related work. And what's been really cool about this, I really like what Steve was saying about trying to create a community, create a field out of meta research. The amazing thing about this is when we've had grant competitions, we've been inundated with proposals. There really is a lot of hunger. I think especially, honestly, among younger scholars, typically, for this kind of work. So the community is forming, and a little bit of funding and support is going to kind of sustain it. So we've had multiple rounds of grant competitions. We just had one. Keep your eyes open for the next round. We call them our SMART grants: social science, meta, research, something. Grants. SMART. Just remember SMART. Transparency. Thank you. Grants. SMART, S-S-M-A-R-T. Okay. So that's one. Last year, we also had our first round of prizes for young scholars who were leaders in the field. This is funded by a different foundation. These are called the Leamer-Rosenthal prizes. So for psychologists, you know who Rosenthal is, the person who invented the term file drawer problem. Economists know who Ed Leamer is, with all of his work about data mining and economics. So we kind of named it after these stellar scholars in the field. Again, there's so much exciting stuff going on in the field. It was very difficult to pick a handful of winners of award recipients. But some folks here are developing new meta-regression tools. Others have started organizations to promote training in these topics. There's really a range of work that we've been recognizing. Lastly, and this is the one I definitely want to emphasize for folks in this room, we have a new pot of funding. We're just launching this for what we're calling the BITS Catalyst Network. I think Metrics may have something similar with affiliates, and Center for Open Science does too. So we're kind of using a similar model. We have funding up to $10,000 per catalyst. You would just reach out to us with a plan. That could be a plan for a conference. That could be a plan for a course. That could be a plan for a small research project that will advance the reproducibility and transparency agenda. And I think we already have 20-something catalysts in the network, globally, but we want to scale that to hundreds. We want folks who are working in this area with cross-affiliations with Metrics or COS, et cetera, who need a small amount of funding to catalyze something to join the Catalyst Network. So please check this out. And if you feel like your aims or interests align with the goals of BITS or Metrics, check it out, and we can see how we can kind of work together to support some of your activity. So there's a lot going on. It's a really exciting space, but hopefully, the punchline of the talk is we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more that can be done to bring some of these tools into play in social science research.
Thank you. You've done what no one else has done, which is you finished early enough so we can actually have a conversation.
Wait a minute. I have 10 more slides.
So we really appreciate it. You can show those in reference to any question. You can say, I pre-specified my answer. So anyway, so the floor is open.
Yeah.
So I was really interested by the registered reports that you described and the timeline that you showed.
Oh yeah, I can bring that up.
In moving to make that more of a reality, I wonder if there are like two challenges to think about. One being that peer review, at least in economics, is pretty slow, right?
Yeah.
And so if that delays you, you might miss a critical chance to collect data. Whereas if you've already written the paper and you're just adjusting it, an extra 5 months might not matter. The other thing is, do you worry that that might cut a bit more against younger, less established researchers who don't necessarily have the name for someone to say, oh, I trust. Like if they saw the results staring them in the face, putting aside these questions about p-hacking, the conventional economist editor or whatever might say, yeah, okay, let's publish this, this is great. Whereas if it's just the study design, they might not be compelled.
I think it's a good question. It's so early that it's hard to know how things will shake out. You might even argue it the other way sometimes, that the current model favors more established scholars. The one thing I will say about, I haven't published a registered report, but now I've written a bunch of pre-analysis plans. In fact, gosh, we're trying to register one this week as data collection starting. There's this kind of push to do it. I will say that what pre-specification does is it front loads everything. You're like investing a ton in a project even before it's taken off. And you might imagine that inherently that does help more established scholars who have more resources, who can sort of have a diversified research project portfolio. For those of us in development economics, everybody knows projects fall apart. There's a coup in the country you're working in. The organization that's collecting data collapses. A lot of things go wrong in the field. And here you have to put all that work in before you get the data. Whereas, you know, in this model, you kind of put a lot of the work into the writing and analysis after it's already panned out in terms of data. So I think there might be a trade-off. There might be a trade-off there along the lines of what you're saying. Now, if there are, you know, sufficient benefits scientifically, I don't think it, you know, I don't know if that concern outweighs those benefits, but it's something we need to keep in mind for sure. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to modify this so that people publish it before they've collected or analyzed the data and then add the results later as like an addendum? Because it seems like all of the scientific that people are judging your scientific career on would be stuff that doesn't require you to actually analyze the data. And
yeah, there's no reason it couldn't be published here and then published again over here. And in fact, there are cases in medical research, and again, you guys are in this world, but correct me if I'm wrong, of protocols being published. I mean, there are venues to publish research protocols. So in some ways, again, medical research is a bit ahead or has gone down a different path than social science research, but there's nothing to stop that from being published. And you know, the nice thing about it getting published then is the scooping issue is gone, published. You have sort of credit for a publication there. Now, I wouldn't say that all the scientific value is there. There may be some element of scientific and scholarly ability in being able to like collect the data and get it all put together and write it up, and you know, there's some value here, but certainly a ton of it is here. A ton of it is here.
We see that approach more and more in clinical oncology trials. When a new complex trial gets introduced and gets approved, there'll be a publication on the details of the trial to let people know in the community more than what you get on clinicaltrials.gov. And it serves as a good reminder. NCI is doing a match trial. This is what required, et cetera. So it is happening. Now, whether that's going to facilitate publication of the final data or hinder it, I think it's worth studying.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I guess to the extent that it raises the visibility of the trial, it's going to help, because then there's going to be accountability. If I'm working in that area, I'll bug my colleague over there and say, wait a minute, you know, you registered this, you published this protocol 3 years ago.
What happened?
What's going on? You know, you can't hide as much. So.
Yeah, so this is related to the other comment about pre-registration. It strikes me that a lot of these issues would come into focus more if publishing null results was normative. And so just as you think about ways to change the field, does outlets for those null results, how does that work into the way that you're thinking about these challenges?
That's a nut that's been hard to crack, because there'd have to be a big change in norms, and you use the word norm change among editors. And what we don't really know now, I'm curious to figure out a way to study this. Actually, I've been brainstorming with colleagues about a way to try to study this. I think editors don't want to publish papers with null results often because they feel like they won't get cited sufficiently. And that, you know, editors are trying to boost citation counts for their journals often, or, you know, again, as an economist, if I was thinking about their optimization, that's a factor. So presumably part of the reason why they want to publish these big, significant, splashy results is they figure they'll get cited more. I don't know if we know if that's true. If you have an important question and a good research design that's well specified, you have a null result, that can be quite an influential finding, but there is a view that that you know, you won't get the citations there. Again, my hope, and this is really the BITS philosophy, the approach we've taken is broad-based training, a decentralized network, a lot of change in practice, and if we can say, okay, all scholars under 35 or 40 or whatnot, we just want to blanket the next generation with these views so they don't think of a null result as a bad thing. Like, we want them to grow up as sort of transparency natives, you know, in some sense. And then maybe the editor's behavior will follow. But there's, like I said, there's been very little interest among editors right now in economics of this.
So this is following on that. How much? So I'm going to push back a little on the pre-specification.
Please.
To what extent is that a solution to the problem of transparency? That is, and could just changing the norms in terms of saying, we looked through 40 models, and that's in the appendix, and this is the one we think is most plausible, and this is why. That would immediately put it in the realm of maybe exploratory.
Yeah.
If you had an extraordinary, in the biomedical field, if you had extraordinary amount of pre-existing evidence that maybe you weren't even aware of until you did the analysis this way, you could bring that to the fore. I mean, I think one of the problems is that it is not the norm to show all the specifications searching, all the model
Yeah.
fitting.
Yeah.
If you did, then why not, then could you get 90% of the value? I mean, I recognize that this is sort of an enforcement mechanism. That is, there's no guarantee that people would do that. But one of the reasons they don't do that, which is related to the null result, is simply that they actually think, in many cases, that publishing or reporting only the positive findings is actually good science. But only
Yeah.
now are they becoming sensitized to the fact
Yeah.
that that's actually sort of malpractice.
Yeah.
So if they began to understand that complete reporting, even if it was partly in the appendix, and saying, we tried 40 models, we're gonna publish 2 here, you know, the other 38 are in the appendix.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that get you pretty far?
So I have 2 answers to that. First, yes, it could